The first time I heard the number loud, in that courtroom, it sounded like someone else's life. $340,000. That was how much my husband said I had stolen from him. I sat at the defense table with my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had gone pale, and I listened to Daniel's lawyer describe me as a woman who had married for money, waited patiently for access, and then quietly emptied an account the moment she saw her opportunity. He said it the way people say facts. Calm. Certain. Almost bored, like he was reading a grocery list instead of describing the destruction of my name. Daniel didn't look at me while his lawyer spoke. He looked at the judge. He looked at the small crowd of people behind us, some of whom I had known for years, people who had eaten dinner at our table and laughed at our jokes, and now sat with their arms crossed like they were watching a stranger. His sister Rachel was one of them. She wouldn't meet my eyes either. When the lawyer finished, the judge, a woman named Judge Ellery Hoyt, took off her glasses, set them on the folder in front of her, and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Marsh," she said, "you've heard the accusation. Do you have anything you'd like to say in response?" The whole room seemed to lean forward a fraction of an inch. I thought about the last 6 months. The nights I'd spent going through statements at my kitchen table after Daniel had fallen asleep, the folder I kept hidden in the bottom of an old paint box in the garage because I didn't trust anywhere else in that house. The moment I realized the person I loved most in the world had built a case against me brick by brick while smiling at me over breakfast. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I do. And I'd like to submit my own evidence, if the court will allow it." I heard Daniel shift in his seat. It was the smallest sound. But after 11 years of marriage, I knew every sound he made, and that one told me everything. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected me to have anything at all. That was his mistake. He had spent months building a case against a version of me that didn't exist anymore, the version who cried instead of asking questions, who apologized instead of investigating, who believed him simply because believing him had always been easier. I wasn't her anymore. To understand how I ended up in that courtroom, you have to go back to who Daniel and I used to be. I met him 9 years ago at a friend's engagement party, back when I was 28 and doing freelance graphic design out of a one-bedroom apartment, and he was a construction project manager with more ambition than capital. He talked about buildings the way other men talked about sports, with real, unguarded enthusiasm. He wanted to develop property. He wanted to build something that would outlast him. I found that kind of hunger attractive, back when I didn't yet understand what hunger can turn into if it's never satisfied. We married 2 years later. I kept freelancing, but I also became, without ever officially calling it that, his unpaid business partner. I designed his branding. I built his first website. When his first development deal collapsed, a strip of townhouses that fell through because his partner backed out, I was the one who sat with him at 2 in the morning helping him restructure the financing so he wouldn't lose the land entirely. I put $22,000 of my own savings into that deal to keep it alive. He promised he'd pay me back tenfold once it closed. It did close, eventually. And for a few years after that, things were good. Better than good. Daniel's company grew. We bought a house. We took a trip to Portugal that I still think about sometimes, before all of this, before I learned what he was capable of. But somewhere in there, something in him changed. It wasn't sudden. It was more like a light dimming slowly enough that you don't notice the room has gone dark until you're squinting to see anything at all. He started taking calls in another room. He got a second phone he said was for work only, and I believed him, because why wouldn't I? He changed the password on our joint investment account and said it was for security, after a scare about identity theft that I later realized might not have even been real. He stopped telling me about deals. He stopped asking for my opinion. He started talking about his money instead of our money, small shifts in language that I noticed, and then talked myself out of noticing, because acknowledging them meant acknowledging something I wasn't ready to face. The first real warning sign came about 8 months before the accusation. I was doing our taxes, I still did our taxes, even after everything, and I found a transfer out of our investment account for $11,000 that I didn't recognize. When I asked Daniel about it, he said it was a consulting fee for a project that never came together. His explanation was smooth. Too smooth. The kind of smooth that comes from a lie that's been rehearsed rather than lived. I let it go. I told myself I was imagining problems that weren't there. I told myself 11 years builds enough trust to survive a little secrecy. There were other small things too, in that stretch of months, things I only understood in hindsight. He started keeping his laptop closed whenever I walked into a room, angling the screen away in a way that felt almost reflexive, like a habit he'd built without noticing he'd built it. He took a weekend trip for a site visit to a project 2 hours away and came back oddly quiet, distracted in a way that lingered for days. When I asked if everything was all right with the business, he told me I worried too much, that I didn't understand the pressure of running a company, that I should trust him to handle things the way he always had. That last part stung more than I let on. I had handled things right alongside him for most of our marriage. I had been in the room for every difficult decision until, gradually, I wasn't anymore. It's a strange kind of erasure, being slowly uninvited from a life you helped build, one polite excuse at a time. I was wrong to let it go, but not in the way anyone expected. The accusation itself came on an ordinary Tuesday. I remember because I had just gotten off a call with a client about a logo redesign, and I was making tea, and Daniel came home early from the office looking like something had already gone wrong before he even walked through the door. "We need to talk," he said. Those 4 words, spoken in that tone, have a very specific weight to them. I set down my mug and turned to face him. "The investment account," he said. "The one with the money from the Hensley Street sale. $340,000 is missing." I remember the confusion first, before the fear. Missing how? Transferred out. In 4 separate transactions over the last 2 months. He was watching me the way you watch someone you've already decided is guilty, searching my face for a flicker of confirmation. "I need you to tell me where it went, Elena." "I don't know where it went," I said. "I didn't touch that account. The transfers came from your login." That sentence landed like a physical blow. Our joint account, the one that held the proceeds from the sale of a rental property we'd bought together years earlier, the property I'd found, negotiated, and helped renovate, had apparently been accessed using my credentials. At times I supposedly logged in from our home network to move money into an account neither of us recognized. I told him the truth immediately. I hadn't logged into that account in months. I didn't even remember the password without looking it up. He didn't believe me. Or he pretended not to. I've never been entirely sure which, and that uncertainty is its own kind of wound. Within a week, he had a lawyer. Within 2 weeks, he had printouts of bank records with my name on the login field, a document with what looked like my signature authorizing a transfer, and a story he'd apparently been telling his family and our friends for longer than I realized. That I had been quietly draining our finances, possibly for months, possibly to fund something or someone he didn't yet understand. The woman who used to trust him completely spent that first week in something close to shock. But somewhere around day 10, the shock started curdling into something else. Something sharper. If I hadn't taken that money, someone had used my name to take it. And I intended to find out who. I didn't tell Daniel I was investigating. I didn't tell anyone, actually, except my sister Priya, who believed me without hesitation and who became, quietly, the only steady thing in those months. I started with the transaction dates. For transfers, each around $85,000, spaced roughly 2 weeks apart. I pulled up my calendar for each date, cross-referencing where I had actually been. The second transfer had supposedly happened on a Thursday afternoon in March. I checked my email. I had been in Denver that day at a design conference I'd traveled to for work, 3 states away from our home network. I found my boarding pass in an old email. I found the hotel receipt with a timestamped check-in. The transaction records claimed I had logged in from our home IP address at 2:14 in the afternoon. At 2:14 in the afternoon, I had been sitting in a conference session about typography trends, with 40 other people around me and a sign-in sheet to prove it. That was the crack. The first one. Small, but real. I kept going. I requested the full login history for the account, which our bank allowed me to do since I was a joint holder, regardless of what Daniel wanted. The history showed logins not just from our home network, but from an IP address I didn't recognize at all, one that, when I looked it up, traced to an office building downtown. Not our house. Not my laptop. A commercial building I'd never had reason to visit. I called the number listed for the building's registered businesses. It took some digging, some patience, and one very lucky conversation with a receptionist who didn't realize she wasn't supposed to confirm anything, but eventually I learned that the office belonged to an accounting firm. Bishop and Cole Financial Services. I recognized the name. Marcus Cole had done freelance bookkeeping for Daniel's company for the past 3 years. That was the second crack. I sat with that fact for 2 full days before I did anything else with it. Marcus had been to our house. He'd sat at our dining table during a small holiday gathering 2 years earlier, complimented my cooking, asked polite questions about my design work. The idea that he might have had any part in what was happening to me felt almost impossible to hold in my mind alongside that memory. But impossible things had already stopped being a reliable measure of what Daniel was capable of, so I kept going anyway. I requested copies of every statement from the account going back 2 years, not just the months in question. I wanted a full picture, not just the transactions Daniel's lawyer had chosen to highlight. Buried in an earlier statement, from nearly a year before the accusation, I found a much smaller transfer, $4,000, to an account with a routing number that matched. Once I cross-referenced it carefully, Bishop and Cole's business account. It was labeled, blandly, as a service fee. That told me something important. Whatever was happening hadn't started with the $340,000. It had started long before that, quietly, in amounts small enough not to attract attention. The big transfers weren't the beginning of the plan. They were the plan reaching its final stage. I want to be honest about something. During those weeks of digging, there were nights I doubted myself completely. Nights I sat in my car outside our own house because I couldn't make myself go inside and pretend everything was normal. Nights I wondered if I was chasing a story I wanted to be true instead of one that actually was. I wasn't fearless. I want to be clear about that. I was scared constantly of being wrong, of being humiliated in front of people who already believed the worst of me, of losing not just money, but the life I had built with my own hands right alongside his. There were moments I nearly gave up and simply accepted whatever settlement his lawyer offered, just to make the accusations stop. But every time I got close to quitting, I'd remember something small. The way he wouldn't look at me in that first courtroom appearance. The way his explanation about the $11,000 transfer all those months earlier had been just a little too rehearsed. Small things, but enough to keep me looking. The third piece came from Rachel, of all people, though not intentionally. Daniel's sister had always been protective of him, sometimes to a fault, and after the accusation she made no secret of whose side she was on. She told mutual friends I had always seemed like she was after his money. She said it at a dinner party I wasn't invited to anymore, and it got back to me the way these things always do. But one afternoon, while trying to be kind, or perhaps trying to gather information for Daniel without realizing she was doing it, she called me. "I just think you should know," she said, "that Daniel's been under a lot of pressure. The Kessler Avenue project isn't going well. He owes people money." I asked her what she meant. She backtracked immediately, said she'd said too much, said I should ask Daniel myself. But it was enough. Daniel's company had a project I barely knew the details of, a mixed-use development on Kessler Avenue that he'd talked about only in vague, optimistic terms. If it was failing, and if he owed people money because of it, that gave him a motive that had nothing to do with me at all. I started digging into Kessler Avenue. What I found took my breath away. Daniel's company had taken out a private loan, not from a bank, but from an individual investor named Victor Aldrich, a man I had never met and never heard mentioned before that week. The loan was for $400,000, secured against the Kessler Avenue project itself. The project had stalled after a permitting dispute, and from what I could piece together through public filings and one very tense conversation with a former subcontractor who was owed money and was more than willing to talk, Aldrich had been demanding repayment for months. Daniel didn't have $400,000 sitting anywhere obvious. But he did have access to our joint investment account, which held the proceeds from the Hensley Street sale, money that, legally and morally, was as much mine as his, given that I'd found that property and helped fund its purchase in the first place. Here is what I believe happened, and what the evidence would eventually show clearly enough for a judge to believe it too. Daniel needed money to pay off Victor Aldrich before the situation became public or, worse, became legal. Rather than admit to me that the Kessler Avenue project was failing and that he'd taken a private loan from a man he shouldn't have trusted, he had Marcus Cole, his accountant, and apparently far more willing to bend rules than I ever imagined, help him move the money out of our account in a way that could be traced back to my login rather than his. It wasn't just about hiding the money from the debt. It was about hiding it from me, permanently, in a way that would let him walk away from our marriage, because by then, I believe he had already decided he wanted out, without having to split what remained of our finances. If I was in prison, or discredited, or too consumed with defending myself to fight for anything in a divorce, he would keep everything. The house. What remained of the business. His reputation intact. Framing me wasn't a side effect of covering his tracks. It was the plan. The email was the piece that changed everything. I found it almost by accident, going through an old shared cloud storage account we'd set up years earlier for tax documents and never properly closed. Daniel had forgotten it still synced automatically to a laptop I used for design work. Buried in a folder of scanned receipts was a set of emails between him and Marcus Cole that had been saved as PDFs, apparently exported for some accounting purpose, and then forgotten. In one email, dated 3 days before the first unauthorized transfer, Marcus wrote, "We can route it through her login, but we need to do it before the divorce filing goes in, or it'll look too convenient. Once it's out, it's out." I read that sentence perhaps 30 times. Before the divorce filing goes in. Daniel had been planning to divorce me before he ever accused me of anything. The theft wasn't a reaction to a marriage falling apart. It was preparation for ending it on his terms, with his money protected and my name destroyed. I printed that email. I saved the original file with its metadata, which showed the exact date it was created and last modified, proof it hadn't been fabricated after the fact, unlike I would come to learn. Some of the documents Daniel's side had submitted as evidence against me. I took everything to a lawyer. Her name was Fatima Rashid, and she was recommended to me by my sister's coworker, a woman I'd met exactly once before I sat in her office and told her the entire story, start to finish, sliding the folder from the paint box across her desk. She read through it slowly. She didn't interrupt. When she finished, she looked up at me and said, "This is a much bigger case than a missing $340,000. "I know," I said. "Do you understand what you're about to do? If we present this, it's not just going to clear you. It's going to expose him. Publicly. Possibly criminally." I thought about that for a long moment. I thought about the version of me who might have, a year earlier, softened this, protected him, found some quiet way to make it all disappear so we could go back to pretending things were fine. He was willing to let people believe I was a thief, I said. He was willing to destroy 11 years of my life to protect $400,000. I'm done protecting him. Fatima nodded slowly. Then let's build the case properly. The case took 4 months to reach trial. In that time, I discovered 2 more things that mattered. The first was the signature. The document Daniel's lawyer had submitted as my authorization for one of the transfers had my name on it, but when Fatima brought in a forensic document examiner, the analysis showed subtle inconsistencies in the pen pressure and letter formation compared to verified samples of my actual signature. Inconsistencies consistent with a traced or digitally reproduced signature rather than one written by hand in the moment. It wasn't a perfect forgery. It was a rushed one. The second was a witness I hadn't expected. Marcus Cole's junior assistant, a young woman named Priyanka Osei who had only worked at Bishop and Cole for about a year, had grown uncomfortable enough with what she'd witnessed that when Fatima's investigator reached out during discovery, she agreed to testify. She had seen the transfer instructions come through. She remembered Marcus telling her, offhand, not to log the transactions under the usual client file because it's a personal favor, not billable work. She'd found that strange enough to remember it clearly months later. Every piece fit into place like something that had been waiting to be found rather than something I'd had to force into existence. That mattered to me. I never wanted to win by inventing anything. I only wanted the truth to finally be visible to someone other than me. Back in that courtroom, after I told Judge Hoyt I had my own evidence, Fatima stood and asked permission to present it. Daniel's lawyer objected, of course, calling it an 11th-hour attempt to distract from clear financial misconduct. Judge Hoyt overruled him calmly and told Fatima to proceed. She started with the boarding pass and hotel receipt, laying them beside the bank's login record for the March transfer. The dates and times didn't just conflict, they made it physically impossible for me to have been the one logging in from our home network at that hour. Daniel's lawyer tried to argue the login records could have been misattributed by the bank. Judge Hoyt asked, evenly, whether he was now disputing his own client's primary evidence. He didn't have a good answer. Then Fatima introduced the IP trace to Bishop and Cole's office. Daniel shifted in his seat again. I watched Rachel, sitting behind him, go very still. Then came the email. Fatima read the line aloud, slowly, letting each word land. We can route it through her login, but we need to do it before the divorce filing goes in. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from before. Judge Hoyt actually stopped writing and looked up. Mr. Marsh, she said, addressing Daniel directly for the first time. Were you planning to file for divorce at the time these transfers occurred? Daniel's lawyer tried to object. Judge Hoyt allowed the question anyway and asked Daniel to answer. He hesitated. That hesitation told the room everything his lawyer's confident opening statement had spent an hour trying to erase. I was considering it, he finally said. And were you aware, Judge Hoyt continued, that these transfers were being made under your wife's login credentials from a location that was not your home? Another hesitation. Longer this time. I trusted my accountant to handle a complicated financial situation, Daniel said. I didn't ask for details. It was the kind of answer that sounds like a defense, but functions as a confession. Judge Hoyt seemed to understand that too. Then Fatima called Priyanka Osei to the stand. Priyanka was nervous. I could see her hands shaking slightly as she raised them to be sworn in. But her voice steadied once she started speaking, the way voices sometimes do when a person finally says something they've been holding for too long. She described the transfer instructions coming through Marcus Cole's office. She described his instruction not to log them under standard client billing. She described overhearing a phone call. She couldn't be certain it was with Daniel, but the timing lined up with the transfer dates precisely, in which Marcus said, "It has to look clean on her end. If it looks clean, nobody questions it." Daniel's lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting she was disgruntled, that she'd been passed over for a promotion at the firm, that her memory of specific phone calls months later couldn't be trusted. Priyanka answered every question directly, without flinching, and when asked why she'd agreed to testify at all if she had nothing to gain, she said simply, "Because somebody built a case to destroy an innocent woman. And I helped make the paperwork look believable without realizing what it actually was. I'm not going to carry that." I watched Judge Hoyt's expression shift almost imperceptibly. I watched several people in the gallery, people who had believed Daniel's version of events for months, shift in their seats. Daniel's lawyer tried one more angle. He suggested that even if the transfers had originated from Bishop and Cole's office, that didn't prove Daniel himself had ordered anything improper, that Marcus Cole could have acted alone, perhaps even against Daniel's own accounts without his knowledge, and that my husband was as much a potential victim of Marcus's misconduct as I was supposedly a victim of mine. It was a clever pivot, and for a moment I felt a flicker of real fear that it might work, that the story could still be reshaped into something that let Daniel walk away untouched. Fatima didn't let it stand for long. She asked Judge Hoyt for permission to introduce the final document in the folder, a set of text messages, recovered through a subpoena of Daniel's phone records, in which he'd written to Marcus only 10 days before the first transfer, asking whether the account access thing could be done cleanly enough that nobody would ever think to look at me first. Judge Hoyt read the message twice before setting it down. She didn't say anything dramatic. She simply turned to Daniel's lawyer and asked whether his client still wished to maintain that he had no knowledge of how the transfers were structured. He didn't answer right away. Daniel leaned over and whispered something to him, and whatever it was, his lawyer's shoulders dropped slightly before he said, quietly, that they had no further questions for the witness. I watched that moment settle over the courtroom like something physical. It was the first time I saw, clearly, on every face around me, the exact instant people stopped assuming I might be lying. The final piece, the one that changed the entire understanding of the case, even for me, came from an unexpected direction. During cross-examination of Marcus Cole himself, who had been called to testify and who had, up until that point, stuck rigidly to a story that he had simply followed client instructions without knowledge of any wrongdoing, Fatima asked him a single pointed question about the destination of the money. Where had the $340,000 actually gone? Marcus answered that it had gone to Victor Aldrich to satisfy the Kessler Avenue loan. That much matched what I'd already pieced together. But then Fatima asked whether the full amount had gone to Aldrich or whether any portion had been retained elsewhere. Marcus went quiet. Judge Hoyt instructed him to answer. He admitted, reluctantly, that only $260,000 had gone to Aldrich. The remaining $80,000 had been transferred into a separate account under his own name, at Daniel's direction, as what Marcus called compensation for handling the arrangement discreetly. Daniel had not simply protected his money from a bad debt. He had paid his own accountant $80,000, my money as much as his, to help fabricate a case that would have sent his wife to prison or, at minimum, destroyed her reputation and her financial future, so that he could walk away from our marriage with everything intact. I sat very still when I heard that number. $80,000. It was, in its own strange way, smaller than everything else, and yet it was the detail that finally made the full shape of his betrayal impossible to misunderstand. He hadn't just been desperate. He had been willing to pay for my destruction. Judge Hoyt did not need much more after that. She reviewed the evidence in full, the travel records, the IP trace, the forged signature analysis, the email, Priyanka's testimony, and Marcus's own admission, and she ruled that the accusation against me was not only unsupported, but that the underlying evidence Daniel's side had submitted showed clear signs of fabrication. She dismissed the case against me entirely. She noted, on the record, that the matter would be referred for further investigation regarding the falsified account access and the undisclosed transfer to Marcus Cole, separate from our divorce proceedings, which were still ongoing. Daniel didn't look at me when the ruling was read. He looked at the table in front of him, at his own hands, the way I imagine a person looks when they finally understand that the story they told themselves for months has run out of road. We spoke once more after that, in a small conference room down the hall, at his request, with our lawyers waiting outside. I was drowning, he said. Aldrich was threatening to go public, to ruin the company, and I panicked. I never meant for it to go this far. You had months, I said. Months where you could have told me the truth. I helped you rebuild once before, Daniel. I would have helped you again. I know, he said, and for a moment I saw something that looked almost like the man I'd married, back before ambition curdled into something colder. I didn't think you'd forgive me for the debt. So I decided it would be easier if you were the one who looked guilty instead. That's not desperation, I said. That's a choice. You didn't just hide a mistake from me. You built an entire case to make sure that if you went down, I went down first and further. He asked if there was any way I could forgive him. He said he still loved me, that the money didn't matter anymore, that he wanted to fix things. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd been in that marriage, the one who found his first property, the one who worked without pay building his brand, the one who sat in a garage searching through paint cans for a hidden folder because she no longer trusted her own home. And I thought about the version of me who almost gave up halfway through this investigation because she was too afraid to keep going. The money was never the worst part, I told him. You could have taken every dollar we had, and I think, eventually, I could have forgiven that. What I can't forgive is that you looked at 11 years of my life and decided my reputation was a reasonable price to pay for your comfort. You didn't just betray our marriage. You tried to take my name away from me. I left the room before he could answer. I didn't need him to. The consequences unfolded over the following months, the way consequences usually do, not in one dramatic instant, but slowly in pieces. Marcus Cole lost his license following an investigation into the falsified transaction records and faced separate legal proceedings for his role in the fraud. Victor Aldrich, it turned out, had his own history of predatory private lending that came under scrutiny once the case became public, which meant Daniel's business troubles were far from over. The Kessler Avenue project was eventually sold off at a loss. Daniel's company suffered. Several clients quietly distanced themselves once word spread, not because of some dramatic announcement, but because reputations in small professional circles travel the way they always do, in careful conversations at dinners you weren't invited to. Rachel called me, eventually. She apologized, awkwardly, admitting she had believed her brother because it was easier than considering the alternative. I didn't fully forgive her either, not right away. Trust, once broken in that particular way, rebuilds slowly if it rebuilds at all. But I let her back into my life a little, because I understood, in a way I hadn't before all this started, that people sometimes choose comfortable lies not out of malice, but out of fear. Our divorce settlement, once finalized, reflected the truth of what had happened. I kept my share of what remained of our joint assets. I didn't get everything I once contributed. Some of it was simply gone, spent, lost to bad decisions I hadn't made, but had to live with anyway. But I got my name back. I got the truth on record, in a courtroom, spoken by a judge who had looked at the evidence and believed me. It's been 1.5 years since that ruling. I still do freelance design work, though these days it's grown into something steadier, a small studio with 2 other designers, work I built almost entirely on my own in the months after the divorce, when I finally had the energy to want something for myself again instead of something for us. I think about that first moment in the courtroom sometimes, the way I sat with my hands folded so tightly while a room full of people waited to see whether I would crumble. I think about how certain Daniel was that I would. He believed I was still the woman who apologized instead of investigating. He never considered that 11 years of quietly noticing things, small inconsistencies, small silences, small shifts in how he talked about money, had built in me a kind of attention he never respected until it was aimed directly at him. I didn't win that case by being fearless. I won it by refusing to stop asking questions even when I was terrified of the answers. If there's anything I'd want someone listening to this story to understand, it's this. The truth doesn't need you to be loud or perfect or certain of yourself every single day. It only needs you to keep looking for it, even quietly, even alone in a garage at midnight with a folder of evidence you're not sure anyone will ever believe. Mine finally spoke for itself. And I never had to raise my voice at all. If you enjoy emotional stories about betrayal, justice, and shocking twists, subscribe to Marrie Tales for more stories like this.